Good evening or good afternoon at your side of the globe. I'm happy to welcome Professor Goldgeier from American University. Thank you for being here. ICEUR is continuing its series of interviews with international experts on Russia and Ukraine. You are a professor of international relations at American University and a visiting scholar at Stanford University's Center on International Security and Cooperation, as well as past president of the Association of Professional Schools of International Affairs, and have written several books on NATO, Russia, and international relations in general. Right now, we are all looking at Ukraine at these times. Russia is continuing its invasion, and intensive fighting is being reported from the capital Kiev and other large Ukrainian cities. And many people are asking themselves right now, what are the strategic goals of Putin's invasion of Ukraine?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on to discuss these horrific issues. It's just such a tragedy for the people of Ukraine, and it's important to note the tremendous outpouring of support from the rest of the world and the unity within NATO and the European Union, and the fact that 141 countries voted in favor of a United Nations resolution condemning the aggression, and only 5 states voted in favor. And when you think of when you look at those 5, Russia, Belarus, Eritrea, Syria, and North Korea, you realize that the international community recognizes there was really no reason or rationale or legitimacy of this mission. So why did Vladimir Putin do it? It's clear that I think he had 2 major goals in mind. These were the 2 things that he would have been unable to get through negotiation, which is why I believed he launched this military assault on Ukraine, having earlier invaded the country, of course, in 2014 and fostered a civil war in the east, in addition to annexing part of Ukraine's territory at that time. The 2 goals were a change in regime. He wasn't happy with the regime of President Zelensky, and he wanted a different government. And I think he also wanted to end Ukraine's right to exist as an independent country, something that he never believed Ukraine had a right to begin with. As I said, other issues he could have gotten diplomacy to address, but nobody was going to negotiate with him on getting rid of a popularly elected government, democratically elected government, or agree that Ukraine no longer had the right to exist as an independent country. And so he launched a war that I think in the end will be hugely damaging to Russia and may be his own undoing. It's certainly extraordinarily counterproductive, in addition to being just devastating for the population on the ground.
Thank you. So President Biden and other world leaders have strongly condemned Putin's invasion. But how effective are the reactions and measures taken by the United States and its allies?
Well, I mean, I think the United States and its allies have done a great job in being unified, in supporting Ukraine with military assistance to help the people defend themselves, galvanizing international support, and also imposing punishing sanctions on the Russians. Unfortunately, if any of these things were designed to change Vladimir Putin's calculations and change his behavior, they've been unable to do that. So they've created huge costs, and these costs are going to be with Russia for a long time to come. Economic costs, sort of delinking Russia from the global economy after Russia's efforts over the last 30 years to become more integrated in the global economy after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's just the whole vision of Russia, its reputation, its ability to act on the global stage. It's become a global pariah now under Vladimir Putin. So all that's occurred, but so far he has not changed course, and so I think we really need to see the actions that have been taken more as punishment and more as raising the costs of this brutal invasion, but not as a set of measures that are changing his calculations or his behavior.
Thank you very much. A few, the European Union looked very different and probably more divided than ever before. But at the moment, many things are happening at the same time, and Europe makes a very unified picture. So, does the Russian threat seem to unify the rest of Europe and the EU? And how could the future of European security architecture look like?
Well, this is a really interesting question because, as you say, Europe is unified in a way that it hasn't been previously, and I think important to recognize that, you know, there have been divisions in the EU and NATO, particularly with respect to certain members within the European Union, for example, concerns over authoritarian Hungary, over democratic backsliding in Poland. Within NATO, concerns about those two countries, as well as Turkey, which has had its authoritarian turn in recent years. And all that's been subsumed by this crisis. And you have, you know, Hungary and Turkey acting in unison with the other NATO allies. You have Hungary supporting the initiatives that the European Union is undertaking during this crisis. So we see this unity. And the big question, I think, for the future of European security is what does the reaction to the Russian invasion, what does it mean in terms of a real European commitment to their own defense? The reliance on the United States has been longstanding ever since the Second World War. And in this crisis, we're seeing how reliant Europe remains on the United States. But we've also seen a German government, which we did not think would achieve 2% of GDP spending on defense anytime in the coming years, announced recently, the German chancellor announced a 100 billion euro increase in German defense spending. We don't know what that's going to be on. You know, what exactly are they going to spend their money on? How will this enhance German capabilities? What about other countries? We're seeing Sweden and Finland in unprecedented cooperation. They've been partners with NATO, but now they're fully engaged with NATO, and they are also sending military assistance to Ukraine. So I think, you know, real questions about Swedish and Finnish membership in NATO potentially, as well as a real European commitment to defense. And what still needs to be sorted out is the relationship between Europe and the United States when it comes to European security. It's heavily NATO dependent to date, heavily dependent on the US. Will this crisis shift things more toward the EU and the EU playing a greater role? That remains to be seen.
Thank you. You just answered my next question. So let me ask you, there have been as well talks about an independent EU security system. How do you think between EU and NATO look like in the future?
Yeah, I think for at least some time to come, NATO will still be the dominant security actor in Europe. But this is certainly increasing calls for a greater EU role. And I think I expect NATO to continue to play the leading role, but if we do really see European countries step up their spending in the face of Russian aggression, this could provide an opening for Europe to play a more substantial role in its own defense. The United States, keep in mind, the Biden administration came into office January of 2021, seeking to focus American attention on China in the Indo-Pacific, which meant that it would hope for less attention on Europe and Russia. That, of course, isn't happening right now. The United States is now back to being deeply engaged in Europe and Russian affairs. But I think the United States still wants to shift its focus to China and the Indo-Pacific, and that always required Europe to play a bigger role. But I think that it may happen that Europe now is going to be doing that over the coming years, but that's still a long-term process.
Thank you. Going back to what you said in the beginning of this interview, Russia looks very isolated at the moment internationally. How long can Putin afford this war, and what does it mean for international relations in general? Has a new era begun?
So the West has been engaged in containing Russia for some years, since the invasion of Ukraine in 2014, but was still trying to actively support diplomacy and find areas to collaborate with Russia on. The Biden administration last summer announced the start of strategic stability talks with Russia. We were expecting arms control talks with Russia, maybe talks on cyber domain. And now really what's happening is Russia is becoming an international pariah. We see not just the countries in the West and the G7 and more broadly, Switzerland joining the sanction, not just states in the international system engaging in this reaction against Russia, but just ordinary citizens and businesses. We're seeing businesses talk about pulling out of Russia. We've seen some major companies pull out decide to end their investments in Russia. I think Russia's access to the West is going to be sharply diminished. And the big question will be, can China make that up for Russia? Can China's support for Russia remains? What that relationship looks like going forward also remains an open question. But I think most importantly is this issue of how much can China make up for Russia what it's losing elsewhere? And how strong will the Russia-China partnership remain? China has to be careful because it's deeply embedded in the global economy. It doesn't want to be implicated in this horrific invasion. But it doesn't want to turn its back on a partner that's been very important to it in recent years. So, but I think really that sort of the goal of Russia's emergence as a great power playing a constructive role in world affairs, I mean, that's over for now. And certainly I think Russia's role, as long as Vladimir Putin remains president of Russia, I think that most countries are going to be extremely suspicious of engaging with Putin and with Russia. And certainly the main European leaders, German Chancellor Scholz, French President Macron, had tried to engage in diplomacy with Russia prior to this military assault, and seemed to think they had gotten some assurances from Russia, which of course meant nothing. And I think we've seen the harsh reaction toward Putin from those leaders since then.
We have been talking a lot about global affairs, but how do they translate to US domestic politics at the moment?
Well, for the moment, we're seeing unity against this invasion. Unity's been hard to come by in the US political system in recent years. We saw President Biden delivered his State of the Union address and spent the first 15 minutes or so on Ukraine, and multiple standing ovations from both Democrats and Republicans for the measures that he's taking and his announcement of what the United States role will be. The Democrats and Republicans remain heavily divided on other issues, especially domestic issues. I don't think this will have huge long-term implications for overcoming those divisions, but the interesting thing to see will be the impact it has on Donald Trump's hold on the Republican Party. Donald Trump went into this war praising Putin, talking about how savvy he was, he's a genius. You now have Republican leaders condemning this invasion. They're not in lockstep with Trump on this issue, and whether or not that provides daylight for non-Trump members of the Republican Party to emerge and to move the party away from the direction that Donald Trump took it, and especially with his weird fixation on Vladimir Putin and praise of Putin. Hopefully we'll see from the Republican Party something different going forward.
Thank you very much. Would you like to add anything in regards to the present situation in Ukraine?
Well, it's just, again, it's just horrible to see innocent civilians being slaughtered. Hard to see the refugees that have been produced, the displaced persons internally, as well as the refugees across borders. It's great that the European Union has been so welcoming of these refugees, since that hasn't always been the case when it comes to refugees trying to come into the European Union. So, hopefully there's some way that the situation won't continue to get worse, but I just fear that it will get worse before it gets better.
I would like to thank you for sharing your point of view and interesting insights with us today.
Thank you.
That's everything from my side.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.